So we're here in Greenbelt, Maryland. Greenbelt is a suburb of Washington, D.C. It's off of the Beltway, and it was constructed as a purpose-built community in 1937. And it was done under the guidance of FDR as part of the New Deal. And the gentleman who was behind it, his name was Rexford Tugwell. And Rexford Tugwell was part of FDR's brain trust, and he helped run the New Deal farm program. So he was actually an agricultural economist. And that was his role. He taught at Columbia University. And so again, we have to think of Columbia being a center of social progressivism, which means optimization, right? Optimization of people and society, and what that means now in terms of ubiquitous surveillance and data analytics and data dashboards and people coming up with prescriptions for what good life looks like. And then later on, the Columbia School of Industrial Engineering became the Center for Technocracy. And then even after that, Columbia and Princeton together were sort of the early developers in terms of high-level real research on theoretical physics that were then consolidated under the Manhattan Engineering District project, the Manhattan Project, and relocated to Chicago, where they were working on the early stages of setting up the atomic bomb research program. So Columbia has all of these, aspects to it, and I think, again, within the context of meritocracy and everything, we imagine that these are all wonderful, academic institutions, but really they do serve power. And the power within the context of Columbia was systems engineering, and social systems engineering is a big part of that. And the education process, I think Dewey was connected with Columbia. So using, compulsory public education to engineer society to create the kinds of humans that you believe that you want to populate the world. So Greenbelt was started in 1937. It was one of a number of towns that was put together under the Resettlement Administration. And I think originally Rexford Tugwell of Columbia, his focus on resettlement was looking at the workers in California who had been displaced not only from the Depression but the Dust Bowl. So Greenbelt was one of about a dozen sort of experimental towns that was put together. And it was actually, initially it had about 880 housing units. Some of the ones that we saw behind us, often multifamily housing, modest housing, and the pre-qualification to get access to the housing was that not only did you meet a certain income level, but that you agreed to be an active civic participant. So that was part of that. It was based on this English Garden Cities ethos. And I really want to talk about that later, about sort of this idea of socialist utopias or the settlement movement, or this idea of, creating built environments that are good for community. Because I came out of an urban planning background. Again, my focus was historic preservation, but it was looking at how you maintain the built environment such that it has historic integrity and is sort of still walkable and accessible for people. But, the urban planning scenario is something that gets a little messy when we start to think about AI and digitally twin cities and sensor-based networks and how that fits into the built environment. So looking all the way back to the English Garden Cities movement, and I will pull out again here my Quakernomics book. A lot of these sort of socialist, idealized utopias were being set up or imagined by very wealthy capitalist class people who were running iron processing plants or textile mills or chocolate factories, and they were the ones who were interested in engineering society so that people would tolerate maybe conditions that were suboptimal, but they would feel really good about themselves as philanthropists. So this goes way back. So the English Garden City as being an inspiration for Greenbelt is important. Behind me, sort of the first mall type shopping, and I don't think I'm going to get to it on this trip because we're running out of time, but Columbia, Maryland, further up, I think it was started in maybe 30 years later, and it had, I think, the first interior mall. So a lot of it is, again, expressing your social archetype through shopping and acquisitions. So the shopping mall is sort of a central piece of it. I mean, not that you don't, everybody needs small businesses. Small businesses are good. I like co-ops. Co-ops are good too. I like cafes, but that they're engineering the shopping behaviors to a very certain end. And, again, just thinking back with the Capital One planned community center. This was early suburban planning. So this is part of the, again, the suburban plans, and really took off in the post-war era with the construction of the interstate highway system and the backing of low-cost mortgages for veterans and for a lot of people, although often not for people of color. So the ability of certain people to go to the suburbs and get equity and build sort of intergenerational capital, that was all part of this. So this was 1937, so early, although I'm not sure if you could own here or if it was all rental. Rexford Tugwell, actually, he also went to Wharton. So before he was at Columbia, he was a graduate student at Wharton. So they're in Philly, again, Quaker school. And while there, he was influenced by Friedrich Winslow Taylor, so Taylorism, the industrial efficiency, social efficiency. And he played a role in the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so we know the extent to which control of food systems is part of this overall program. And then later, after building Greenbelt, he became the first director of the Planning Commission for New York City. And he helped develop something called the Progressive Party in 1948, and something called the New States of America platform, where he really wanted planning to be incorporated at the federal level of like a fourth body that was devoted to planning. And evidently, this is sort of an interesting bit of history. They said that in Philip K. Dick's novel, Man in the High Castle, that I haven't read it, but that there's like a novel within the novel. And the main novel, I guess, is the premise that the U.S. Lost World War II and we were run by Germany and Japan. And the Cold War wasn't a Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but between German, Japanese occupied United States against Great Britain. And so the story within the story evidently features a narrative arc where Mr. Rexford Tugwell supersedes FDR after the war in terms of being president. So that's sort of an interesting bit of information. So I think that says a lot about Greenbelt. The thing that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned, I've been doing some additional research into something called sociocracy. A lot of people have their different isms and ocracies, and their pet one that they think it's this, right? This is the label that I'm going to put on it. For me, I like to sort of explore all the different ones because I feel like it's really this potpourri of control systems. But sociocracy was actually initiated in 1851 by the philosopher Auguste Comte, and it was about applying science to society. So really the early social engineering. And in the 1920s, there was a gentleman by the name of Kees Boeke, or Boeke, and he was from the Netherlands, and he developed a boarding school, a Quaker boarding school. And a gentleman attended that. His name was Gerhard Endenburg, and he became an electrical engineer. His family business was electrical engineering. And so this idea of sociocracy is sort of consensus decision making, and it comes out of this sort of Quaker aspect of consensus. And I think that the consensus decision making is very integral with blockchain technology, digital identity, and tokenized participation. I think that the Quaker consensus method is going to be completely integrated into this new blockchain system, and essentially uplifting the agency of the individual, that you act out your agency through sharing tokens on blockchain for the common good, for the collective good, and that is the decentralized network system. So Endenburg, he developed this sociocratic method as an electrical engineer and a corporate guy, and he was doing consulting work on, again, this decision-making process back in the 70s with both Philips Electronics, which is very much in the sort of wearable technology health space, and also with Royal Dutch Shell. So he was consulting on this decision-making process with people at very high levels. And then in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was this gentleman by the name of John Buck, who decided to create something called the Sociocracy Group, where he was actually melding, and this is what I'm saying, the premise of sociocracy and collective decision making with agile computing. and I just was trying to get familiar with agile computing. The only thing I knew about agile computing was when I was looking at California and their pay for success finance programs, that the preschool data set systems were set up by a guy who, I think he worked for BAE before he did the preschool data architecture, and his project for 15 years prior to that had been developing agile systems for FBI case file records, which I always, like as a mom, you kind of get, it's sort of shocking to imagine the same technology applied to FBI case files and pre-K children. But that's the one time I had heard of agile. But when I looked it up, it was very much about distributed, resilient, agile, computerized networking systems that were used in extreme environments like disaster relief or humanitarian aid, or these various and tactical uses of connected devices, and often used in military purposes or defense purposes. And that this is becoming more and more relevant as we're existing in ubiquitous computing sensing systems, and they need resilient networks that are very flexible. And so what he was doing, this gentleman, John Buck, was to meld like the collective decision making with the agile computing, and to me that feels like the tokenized blockchain aspect. And he was working with a woman named Sharon Villins. And so they actually have a consultancy based here in Greenbelt. And I think it's important when we're talking about social engineering, social standards, participatory process, civic life, civic participation, civil society, what that means when the major employer of Greenbelt is also NASA Goddard, which is the space-based sensing system of Earth systems, right? And keeping an eye on you, talk about Big Brother from outer space. And that one of the major employers in this area is actually the NASA Goddard Space Center. And so I think that's really important. Because I like I said, I lived out in College Park, Maryland very briefly, and I knew that this existed, but there are about 10 NASA research centers, and I didn't really have a good sense of what Goddard was about. I never went out to visit it. But actually what Goddard does is they do the instrumentation for outer space. And so they do instrumentation to study both the universe, outward looking, right? And we know from some of the work that Leo has done, this idea of spectroscopy and energy and radiation waving and how that affects life on the Earth. And then also looking down from satellites to the Earth itself. And that is a key piece of what's coming with blockchain sensor-based technology for sustainability and greening. When you picture the giraffes wandering around with a heart monitor rate to pay for their drone surveillance, well, some of it is drones, but then also a lot of it is satellites, and that's that Intel sat, that the building that I saw earlier this morning. And so NASA, not surprisingly, is a key player in that space of managing space, right? And of course, it's space for good, or space for peace, and space for cybernetic control grid of life on the Earth, and to profit impact investors who are investing in these sustainable new technologies. So I think that the NASA Goddard aspect of being incorporated into Greenbelt is really interesting, because Greenbelt itself, in addition to being built on under the jurisdiction of FDR and the New Deal, right now we're to the Green New Deal. Well, this is the New Deal. It was based on cooperation, social progressivism, and sort of managed, facilitated community engagement. And that's all going to be impact investing as well, right? So the managed behavior, this is the early origin, circa 1937, of the managed behavior. Only now, instead of your neighbors peeking out their windows and making sure your kids are doing the right thing, it's the satellite and the drone surveillance getting the data for the impact metrics for these financial deals. Because they need the veneer of liberal progressivism, right? They need this liberal veneer, and it's worked for a really long time. Clearly it's worked for 250 years that we've bought into this narrative, but ultimately it's run by the people who are at the top. It's not a bottom up, really. As much as they want to talk about it being horizontally networked, the game itself the network itself was set up by the people at the top of the food chain, creating the factories and running these companies. And as I mentioned this morning, those companies include places like MITRE and Northrop Grumman weapon systems, because Quakers made weapons too. So I think that's pretty much it. I would encourage people to look up Sociocracy. They have another institute actually that's operating in Amherst, Massachusetts, but UMass Amherst. I don't know that it's in affiliation with the university. I don't think it is, but Amherst itself is actually a hotbed of a lot of defense contracting as well. So so that's Greenbelt, Maryland. I'm probably not going to make it to Columbia, Maryland, but more recent planned community. I think its name was Joseph Rouse. He got it set up. And actually, an early funder of that planned community was a Connecticut life insurance firm. And so that's going to hook us back into pay for success and prescribed wellness behaviors, and the fact that these big insurance companies with all of their premiums are going to be pouring them into pay for success deals in smart communities. So I think we have the triad of Capital One Center being a gleaming, fancy, the vision of sustainable, walkable, fun, high-class living, but it's not going to actually be that way. It'll probably be more like modest, maybe cozy, but whatever, like the Greenbelt, but with lots and lots of sensors. And as I was trying to pull into the Greenbelt parking lot, which was one way, like a police car had pulled up right behind somebody in a pickup. I mean, this is Sunday afternoon, nothing is going on, and totally blocked the way, you totally couldn't get in. So that was that's twice today that I've been had my route blocked by police presence. And soon enough, you can imagine some little robo-dogs, Boston Dynamic robo-dogs wandering up and down, making sure everybody's behaving the way the computer says that we should behave. And then Columbia, Maryland, which is the one that had the indoor mall, was backed by the insurance company, and is more recently acquired by Howard Hughes Real Estate. And so I think we need to understand that, our right to have housing, for so many people are housing insecure. It's a huge concern, but that's going to be a pay for success market. And when you live in community like this, in community with these rules, which I'm not, saying I'm not totally against rules. I actually follow most rules, but people in power game the system, and they game the system to hurt people who don't know the rules or who aren't in a position of changing the rules. Oh, sorry, just looking for my backpack. So, I have a friend who actually, she's trying to navigate a situation where she bought into a condo association in a community that served a lot of people of, fixed income folks, and it became desirable real estate. So people from out of state with a lot of money came in and bought units and took over the homeowners association, and brought the development became embroiled in a lawsuit with a neighboring property, something, not a big deal, but no one could sell their unit because it was in litigation, and that stuff just drags on forever. And then there was something with the seawall that needed a repair. They all of a sudden they came up with this, things that might have been fine for years and years and years, oh no, there's this imminent need for a repair. And then all of the monthly rates that the condo owners were supposed to pay tripled. And people on fixed incomes can't do that. And I think that was done very strategically, because then the people who had moved in and taken over the homeowners association could just pick up at rock bottom prices these other units. And so there's many things, I know Jason really always talks about property ownership. It's very sneaky, things that we would never imagine would be the case, for people who follow all the rules and do all the right things, that all of a sudden everything can be taken from you, over the course of a year or 6 months. Through no fault of your own. That's just the way the system works. And I think we have to realize that this is a game. And, maybe the New Deal wasn't all that we thought it was, right? Maybe FDR wasn't what we thought it was, right? To me, the whole New Deal was the setup for this new Green New Deal, which is going to be the cybernetic sustainability program. And again, who is making out on that? It is the BlackRocks of the world. It's the UBS banks, the Deutsche banks. It's having everybody here bring their own shopping bags. I'm not against that idea, and I do it myself, but that's not actually going to solve the pollution that's created by the defense industrial complex. That just doesn't do anything to that. people bringing their grocery bags aren't doing a darn thing to offset what Northrop Grumman is doing out there. So we need to have these bigger conversations, and we need to sort of, I think, get beyond the performance phase and look at the really deep structures. Because as much as Northrop Grumman is a problem, at the same time, you know, there are a lot of, you know, middle and professional class people who send their kids to nice colleges so they can go work for defense contractors like that, because that's all there is. So we need to build a world that there are other options. So anyway, this is Greenbelt. You know, it looks good, co-op, credit union, cool cafe, kind of a creepy mother and child statue, but the history with progressivism, how it's fitting in with the cyber-physical systems, and that's all what the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, you know, and was about, and what MITRE is about. And I don't know where it's going, but hopefully we can educate people enough that we can have at least an intelligent conversation before it all goes down. And one end of the shopping plaza, we have this statue. It's by this person, Lenore Thomas. She was trained at the Art Institute of Chicago, and she did a lot of sort of monumental sculpture during the New Deal under Roosevelt. So this is Mother and Child. It's a bit unusual as a sculpture. I guess there's a number of these statues in Greenbelt. I'm not sure. I can't quite tell if this is like, what is the child drinking? Like drinking a glass of water or a glass of milk, or does it have its mouth on a book? It's hard to say, but this is at the base. This is where I put our little heart. Again, dandelion outlines, and we've got the acorns that were from up on the stations of the crosswalk yesterday, and a beautiful little mushroom and a feather, and a linden, a bit of linden. And I will say, I forgot to mention when we were at the abandoned insane asylum, the linden. This is the one with the two buds. I got that on right next to my car as I was getting in my car to come down. Philip Rosedale, he was the gentleman who created Second Life, and his lab to create this sort of artificial digital world was called Linden Labs. And so I think there's something significant about linden in that the trees, it's also called basswood or lime, that they're often used for acoustic instruments for guitars, and they're carved and used in a lot of altar pieces in the sort of early Renaissance in Europe, carvings. And then again, we've got the love in a puff, which I love those, and they really hold their shape so nicely. And some lovely lichen. So lichen, which is, I'm trying to remember, it's two beings together. It's a fungi and a cyanobacteria maybe, but they work together, collaborative, and I guess that's more the natural collaboration that we're looking at. And the mom. So I'm gonna just scoop these guys up because I think they're attracting a bit of attention and people are not sure what's what with this. So again, the heart is under the mother and child, which is appropriate. And I'll just give a quick walk around. So again, this development was created in 1937. It was during the Depression. The focus was on low-income people. I think they had 885 housing units and 5,000 applicants. And so this is their grocery store. It's a cooperative. I think this stuff must all date to that era. It's sort of Art Deco. And you've got, of course, the movie theater, because you need the Hollywood programming, right? And now I guess it looks like it's a bit of an art house theater. And then you've got over here the credit union. And again, I'll just make a note that the credit unions were actually some of the ones who were very early on in the blockchain identity space. So if you look up blockchain identity and credit unions, that comes up. And then next door to it is a cafe, and it is the New Deal Cafe, because this is all sort of connected to that progressive outlook with FDR. So again, it's supposed to be open, walkable. It actually is rather pleasant. There are people out, enjoying, teens hanging out, doing hair, people out having a beer at the cafe. And I'm just going to walk up a bit just so you can see the housing. So it was often multi-unit housing. And if you remember the conversation Jason and I had about Laura Aralag Andresen, that they were not at all interested in having multifamily unit housing. So to depress their property values. But Greenbelt, Maryland is quite a bit of sort of modest multi-unit housing in various combinations. Actually, it looks pretty well kept up, this sort of Deco era architecture. And the people who were screened to come and live in this community, they had to agree to be active in civic life. So the whole civil society aspect, that was a big piece of life here in Greenbelt, Maryland. And you can sense, like, it is a nice scale, human scale, trees, shade, not sort of super fancy. I believe that Greenbelt was one of these early outdoor mall-like shopping centers. And so, it is quite interesting that they have the mother and child as central in this social area.